This will be a little different. This is also a project that is really just getting going, at least our involvement in it. So just kind of putting it on your radar and hoping it maybe stimulates some feedback or discussion or gets you excited to see progress as we continue through it in the coming years. So yeah, I'm going to be revisiting a theme another theme that we've been talking about a lot here, seismic lines, and talking about a project where we're starting to monitor some restoration of seismic lines. So yeah, I don't need to beat a dead horse, I guess. We know that seismic lines are quite extensive and in many cases persistent on the landscape, and that has a detrimental impact on caribou through increasing predator efficiency and also broader impacts on wildlife habitat by fragmenting it. There's been some work on songbird species like ovenbirds and some recent papers from Aaron Bain and Stan Burton and their student Jesse Tigner looking at effects of seismic on black bears and marten. So not just a caribou issue, but a broader wildlife issue. Of course, I only define wildlife as large mammals, so I'm not going so broad. But it can go all the way to earthworms if you wish. There's another student of Aaron Bain's who's done some work on looking at the effects on earthworms. So this is a project that the Algar Caribou Habitat Restoration Program is a big project that has been done by many others. And I'm not here to speak on behalf of the restoration program. I mean, John Peters and I don't know if Rochelle's here, others can do that. And certainly I welcome them to jump in if I misrepresent anything. But this is a big restoration project that just basically wrapped up in terms of the treatments and was done by formerly the Osley group of companies, now COSIA companies, led by Nexen and working with Silvacom and their LEAP process, which you can see more about at the back there. And it ran for about, I guess, 5 years here and just wrapping up the treatments this past year. And the goal was to restore habitat for the Algar herd within the Eastside Athabasca range by restoring these conventional legacy seismic lines. And over 300 kilometers of lines were assessed and about half of those treated with this site preparation and coarse woody debris treatment, and the others protected because natural regeneration was progressing well. And just to orient you, it's here southwest of Fort Mac, where the Athabasca takes a bend there just west of Algar Lake, and it covers 6 townships of area there. It's a very wet, boggy landscape, as you might guess. Lots of black spruce lowland in blue here and tamarack lowland. Some pictures up above. Not a highly impacted landscape in the sense of seismic lines. These legacy seismic lines that are generally more sparsely distributed across the landscape, and you can see how they could make a big influence if a wolf can really cut through that landscape using one of those lines. There is more upland habitat, deciduous habitat along the Athabasca River on the west and southern end here. There's a shot of what some of that looks like just along the river valley there. So in terms of treatment, this comes from John Peters' group's work at Silvacom. And as I mentioned, they were mounding and planting black spruce. Was it exclusively black spruce or?
And white spruce.
White spruce, yeah. And using coarse woody debris. So obviously the goal is to speed on revegetation of these areas that aren't recovering, but of course to also in the caribou context to provide this blockage to impede movement by tearing up these lines. And so a lot of lines were treated in this manner, and they did individual silvicultural prescriptions that I'm not going to talk about, but we essentially sort of lumped the treatments into one category here, which we called site prep and plant. And they also protected many lines that were regenerating naturally better. And so this is their map here, showing in yellow all the lines that were treated across this landscape. Some of the orange lines, if you can see, were lines that were left because they're being used by trappers. And these purple areas were lines that were left as controls for our wildlife monitoring. So we really wanted to set aside some areas that would have been treated. They had the same conditions to be treated, but were left so we can actually try and isolate the effect on wildlife. Here's just a shot of some of these lines, the treatments from the air. The snow nicely highlights some of the mounding across these long stretches of lines. So, you know, measuring kilometers of lines treated is one way to measure success, but of course we want to really understand how the wildlife are responding, and there is some vegetation monitoring going on that I believe John's group at Silvicom is doing, but we really wanted to look more directly at wildlife responses to these treatments. And of course the first main question is to look at how caribou predators are using or not using the treated lines, but we're also interested in the broader mammal community and how it's affecting them, how ecological function, I guess you could say, is being restored through these treatments. So we're interested in these questions, but also in the general process of trying to design and test out an efficient monitoring system. So the usual suspects here, mainly thinking about wolves and black bears when we're thinking about the top predators here. And so we're hypothesizing that these treated lines will provide enough movement blockage or enough, they will disturb the lines enough that we'll see less use of these lines on the treated areas as compared to the control areas. And then for the other species, I just said more reflective of reference conditions. So, probably using them less in the sense that sometimes these lines are the basis for travel corridors for a bunch of species. But as you get to smaller species, it could be that they might even use them more in some ways. And I should say here, so as I mentioned, this is just getting going, this project. And really at this point I'm kind of focusing on the behavioral response, so the use of these lines by these species. But we are interested in two scales, so we're also interested in kind of a population level response. And our idea is to try and cluster our sampling a bit, ideally, so that we can look both at use of individual treatments and controls, but also kind of at more of the township scale. We're still working on how to implement that part of it. And we're also interested in two time scales. So, I think we all agree we don't have 20, 30 years necessarily to wait for results from programs like this as the vegetation recovers. So by using these controls, we really want to be able to provide this contrast so we can look at short-term responses from the line blocking from these sort of movement barriers, as well as trying to build a sampling foundation that we can use to generate the statistical basis for saying something about how long might we have to monitor or how many sites might we have to include to get a statistically robust response from this monitoring program over time. So here's this figure again. I mean, I realize I included it in both talks. It's kind of a shameless plug for a paper that we all worked on and published recently. But I think I included it because someone else drew it. And anything I try and draw looks terrible on PowerPoint. So the point is that here that we think that camera traps, again, are a useful tool in this context to try and monitor these responses. There are plenty of different tools that can be used, and ideally we might be throwing all the tools at it. But certainly if you consider something like snow tracking, it's very seasonally restrictive. It's very challenging to get your teams on the ground in the right conditions 3 to 5 days after a track obliterating snowfall, these kinds of constraints. That's part of the reason why the ABMI has switched from a snow tracking program to a camera program. If you look at telemetry, that's a more direct way to monitor animal movements. But the problem is we can't control where the animals go. And we saw from the deer project, sometimes you'd color an animal and then it would run off to Saskatchewan or to a different landscape. And suddenly you lose your ability to really assess your treatments because the animal isn't interacting with those treatments. Whereas cameras, you can really isolate your surveys to those treatments. And you can run them year-round. You can account for seasonal variation, which has been shown to be quite important in some of the use of features like seismic lines. And as we saw from the deer project, you can relatively, we would argue, cost-effectively get multi-years of monitoring with fairly minimal input in terms of just servicing those cameras once or twice a year to keep them going. So I think that's all I wanted. That's the point I wanted to make here is that we're making a case that camera traps can be an efficient tool to look at these things. Oh, I guess the other point is that they're also quite scalable from trying to have a sampling point on an individual feature, if we can imagine a seismic line here, to trying to look maybe across landscape replicate units. We think the cameras provide a nice standardized tool that is readily scalable across these different sort of scales of interest or inference. So yeah, I'm not going to have results to talk about because we just got this thing off the ground thanks to the UPRF funding, and to our we're working with Nexen and the other companies to try and design this. And what we've started with is a pilot survey. So we wanted to assess the logistics of getting the cameras on the landscape and then get some initial detection rates in this landscape that we can use to do a statistical power or precision analysis to try and come up with a more optimized sample size. So we got out there earlier this month, and here's Luke Nolan from AITF setting a camera on one of the treated sites. So you can see quite good mounding and some coarse woody debris, and they're really quite beastly to walk across. And then here's a control site. So as I said, similar conditions. The Silvacom and COSIA team sort of decided which ones would be left as controls, but the idea was to match them so that we're talking about similar conditions here, and they can be a nice, there can be a nice comparison across them. And yeah, it's a difficult area to access. It's a helicopter access. There used to be some winter access, but it's more difficult now that all the restoration treatment is done and there isn't any infrastructure on site. But we got in there and we set two, I guess, clusters of camera traps. I think I've switched colors on you here, but the orange ones are the control sites, and there are more control lines up in this area. The green were the natural regeneration lines, and then purple were these site prep and plant lines. So we set 12 cameras up in the sort of northwestern part, and then 12 down in the southern part of the study area, 6 of each control and treatment, and did our best to, these were randomly selected from among the pool that we had in this area. For now, we've avoided this middle section because we wanted these to be geographically clustered. And we tried to keep cameras either on different lines or at least a kilometer apart if they were on the same line, and a few hundred meters apart if they were on adjacent lines, so that we can try and treat these as independent replicates to compare the treatment and control. So here's one of the cameras doing its work on a control line here. And yeah, so these are now out, and we're hoping to get back there probably in the spring to get our first data from the area from these cameras, and hope that they functioned as they were supposed to, and that we don't get an incredible snowfall year like in the deer project that covers the cameras or something. And then, as I said, we want to do a power analysis from these initial detection rates, and we're going to also try and borrow information on detection rates from other projects as well, so that we can say, well, how many samples do we think we need to be certain that we're not just going to be, at the end of the day, say, well, we have a non-significant result that sort of suggests something or other. We want to try and build a robust sample. And there are also a couple other strata on the landscape that we could consider. So there are these natural regeneration lines and these open lines that may be getting more human use that we'd like to fill those out, as well as adding more of the, well, we're pretty much near the end of what's available for the control lines, but we could add some of the site prep and plant lines from different ages. Some of them were treated in different years. So we want to expand the sample. And what we're really interested in and just thinking about now is sort of these larger landscape level comparisons. And so I've sort of marked out the deer project area here, but I know there are other seismic restoration projects going on in that area, like Lydia, and others associated with the regional Caribou program there. So what we think would be quite interesting is to take this control treatment comparison and replicate it at a larger scale as well. It can be challenging to find these different landscapes, but you can see, if you can see as Jason was showing before, the intense seismic line density in this environment as opposed to this environment where it's relatively less dense legacy lines. So the landscape context might also be important in how the wildlife respond. And other linkages we're looking into making are taking these targeted camera trap assessments and trying to link them to some of the broader regional surveillance monitoring that's starting up, like through the ABMI, where sparsely distributed cameras are trying to get us a glimpse of the background or baseline status of wildlife populations in the larger landscape. And we think there's some neat opportunity to link some of these more focused, targeted camera trap assessments with these regional surveillance assessments to try and provide that sort of reference or baseline comparison against which we can really try and assess the responses to seismic lines without having to wait for all the vegetation regrowth.